switch on the microphone and speak to the importance of the content of this compendium report. Thank you. Nana.
Hello. Hello, good morning, and magandang umaga para sa Pilipinas. I am Yori Pasco, 67 years old, a core leader and volunteer of Rise Up for Life and for Rights. And I represent the families of victims killed during the time of Duterte on the war on drugs. On May 12, 2017, Crisanto and Carlos Lozano, my two sons, were killed when Duterte launched his war on drugs campaign in June 2016. For us, family of victims, war on drugs, it is not a war really on drugs, but a war against the poor, because most of the slain personalities were poor. They work as pedicab drivers, construction workers, vendors, and other odd jobs. Until now, killings continue. For almost 6 years after Duterte ended his term as president, we are still seeking for justice for our loved ones who were killed by war on drugs. We challenge the new president to let the International Criminal Court, the ICC prosecutor, and the pre-trial chamber to have an independent investigation, since this was the recommendation of the former ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. We want the president to recognize the ICC investigation. Families of war on drugs victims urge the president to have a social service program for us and to the other poor families. The government must address housing problems, social and health services, job security, poverty alleviation, rather than promoting climate of impunity and killing projects. We believe that addiction is not a crime, but a sickness which needs medical attention. We also believe that poverty and availability of social services are breeding ground of drug addiction. Persons with substance abuse should be given proper medication, rehabilitation, and health care. We urge the government to address the problem of illegal drug trade. Lastly, we want justice for our loved ones and to all the families whose rights were violated. We hold the perpetrators accountable for their crimes committed. We hold Duterte accountable, and we demand the current president to make it sure that Duterte will be accountable. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to share my story. I carry with me the stories and the cries for justice of the many families seeking for justice. Please do not give up on us. Thank you for believing in us, and I thank the social justice movement who made it possible for our stories to be heard.
Thank you very much, Nana Laurie. And I now introduce Sunny Africa from the Yvonne Foundation.
Good morning. I'm going to sort of elaborate just a little bit at the time myself, because I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what Peter mentioned about the ultimate roots of our rights violations in the country. The Philippines right now, actually, I think for a lot of people, it doesn't seem so bad. We're on the cusp of upper middle incomehood. We've been a so-called investor darling for some years now. The government is claiming among the most rapid economic growth, not just in the region but in the world, for the last maybe 10 years, especially in the last couple of years also. So on that regard, the Philippines looks quite pleasing for many outsiders. It is pleasing for a few because unfortunately the Philippines does remain among one of the most unequal societies in the world. And if in the earlier session there was talk about the smoke and mirrors of rights violations, in terms of social and economic rights, there is also the smoke and mirrors hidden by the huge inequality in the country. And being among the most unequal societies in the world, there's huge unmet economic, social, and cultural rights, and including outright violations, especially among indigenous peoples, urban poor, displaced by corporate projects, displaced by infrastructure projects and other pro-big business efforts. And I think one thing that we do want to highlight, there are extremely huge income gaps in the Philippines. And just sort of, I'm not going to burden everyone with a lot of details, but just to highlight how big the problem is. Just about 12 to 15,000 families have monthly incomes of $5,000 a month, which is actually not very high, to as much as $150,000 or more per month. These include families whose incomes have increased in the last 2 to 3 years of the pandemic. On the other hand, at least 6 out of 10 Filipinos, about 60%, maybe about 15 million families, work with about $190 to maybe $380 per month. So there's a huge income gap already there. But the income gap also masks an incredibly huge wealth gap. The richest 50 Filipinos have assets, have net worth, equivalent to the poorest 70 million Filipinos. And that doesn't make sense. But again, that is part of that smoke screen being created. And what we do want to highlight, and we were having some side discussions earlier among some colleagues, there is a problem, I think, in terms of struggling for economic, social, and cultural rights, because the denial of the right to work, to food, to health, to education, it's often not because of any particular policy of the government. When we talk about economic structures, economic systems, it is the whole complex of economic policy measures that create the kind of economy that prevents the achievement of the rights to food, to work, education, all of that. And what we do want to stress is that these are because of an accumulation of neoliberal economic policies for the last 40, 50 years. There's no other way to explain why the Philippine economy has eroded in the last 40 years. Agriculture has fallen to its smallest share in the country's history. Manufacturing is its smallest in 70 years. These are at the roots of the huge crisis of joblessness. The Philippines, even before the pandemic, but especially after the pandemic, we're seeing increasing informality with the associated low earnings. We're seeing declining wages and decent work for workers. The Philippines has been seeing flat wages for the last decade and a half, declining in the last 3 years, especially after the pandemic. And I think that's one of the things driving the huge numbers of Filipinos abroad. I'm pretty sure some of us here have encountered some Filipinos somewhere, and that's because there are not enough jobs in the Philippines. So rather than an economic success, one of the biggest signs of the country's economic failure is this huge out-migration of Filipinos. And I think I want to stress close with one important conclusion. These policies have been fought against for many, many years by popular mobilizations, by social movements. They have been forced upon the Filipino people. The trajectory of neoliberalism has been a trajectory of authoritarianism. The Marcos dictatorship started the Philippines on the path of neoliberal economic policies. In subsequent administrations, despite not being open dictatorships, have actually implemented authoritarian policies. Of course, reaching a new high under the previous Duterte administration. But probably in closing, I think it's quite important to stress that it is a battle for economic, social, and cultural rights. It is a battle that unfortunately One side has the resources of government, has the armed might of the military and police, and has the repressive infrastructure of the government being used against them. As long as that is happening, we will see a violation of civil and political rights, and we will see a pushback against people's struggles for achieving their economic, social, and cultural rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunny. I'll now introduce Amira Lidasa from Sanduga.
Yes. Assalamualaikum. Okay. Assalamualaikum. Now, I thank the Investigate PH for documenting what has been happening in Mindanao and for your brothers and sisters, Bangsamoro people, because under the new administration, it seems like they're forgetting what happened in Mindanao, specifically in Marawi City under President Rodrigo Duterte. In 2017, we were here for the UPR, and I don't think that many have addressed the situation in Marawi City. The Bangsamoro people were pushed into a humanitarian crisis and deeper into poverty following the declaration of martial law by former President Rodrigo Duterte in 2017 and his anti-terror campaign against quote-unquote extremist groups. So from May to October 2017, the armed forces of the Philippines launched military airstrikes and mortar shelling in Marawi City and other Bangsamoro areas that resulted to the displacement of at least 40% of the population in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. The Bangsamoro civilians bore the brunt of these military operations, aided by foreign troops and armaments, undermining their civil and political rights. In Marawi City alone, more than 350,000 were displaced and millions worth of properties destroyed, including religious and cultural sites. Families continue to report missing relatives and fear that they were killed due to indiscriminate bombings and arrests at checkpoints. There were reports of arrest, torture, and detention of innocent civilians, and they're all recorded there in the compendium. BARM in 2018 had a high poverty incident, or a year after the martial law declaration, of 61% of the 4.2 million total population. And according to UNICEF, 74.3% or 108,600 families were poor, and child poverty is at its highest in 2018 at 68% for 1.3 million children living in poverty. In 2019, the high poverty incident continued at 53%, with a population that lacked access to potable water, affecting 48.6% of the population. The region also has the lowest functional literacy rate at 71.6%. Until the end of his term, President Duterte has not addressed the displacement of the Bangsamoro people, despite of the 350 billion or $7 billion foreign loans, grants, and aid that were channeled to the rehabilitation of Marawi City under the Task Force Bangon Marawi. 5 years into the rehabilitation efforts, at least 17,067 families or 85,335 individuals are still displaced or were not allowed to go back to the 250-hectare area consisting of 24 barangays dubbed as the most affected areas. While President Duterte was able to pass the Republic Act 11696 or the Marawi Siege Compensation Act of 2022 at the end of his term, under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the compensation law still lacks the members of the board that are tasked to draft implementing rules and the necessary budget appropriation. And despite having a new president, the same anti-terror policies are used against the Bangsamoro people. The government still operates using the ASG and the IC's presence in Bangsamoro areas to continue Operation Pacific Eagle Philippines, the new contingency operation signed in 2017 to support the AFP in its fight against ISIS and other terrorist organizations. This Operation Pacific Eagle is an U.S. military operation plan. Through the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 and the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, they are being used to weaponize governments against human rights defenders and critics, and further shrinking the democratic space in the Philippines. What is worrisome now is how the new administration will go to great lengths to cover up the dire human rights situation in the Philippines and avoid accountability by putting the blame on the previous administration. But as we have said, we hope that the members of the UNHRC in the deliberation on Monday for the UPR on the Philippines, we hope that they will take into account all the reports that we have, and not just listen to the reports of the Philippine government. And we hope that in the counter-terrorism programs of the government, it's been 2 decades now since the US-led war on terror, and still our brothers and sisters are suffering this kind of discrimination or discriminatory policies whereby the Muslims are still being attacked, and civil and political rights are being undermined. We hope that member states will push, or will urge our government, to end the practice of arbitrary arrest, torture, and prolonged detention of innocent Muslim civilians who were accused as terrorists in exchange for bounty and justification for U.S. military aid and operations in the Philippines. We also hope that they could urge the Philippine government to invite special rapporteurs such as Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights to conduct an inquiry into the reported violations by the government of the rights of the Bangsamoro people in the course of implementation of counterterrorism, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amira. So we've heard now from the panelists, and I'd like to invite any questions that member states have to any of the speakers, or any comments you would like to make about the compendium report. Okay, in that case, if there's no questions from you, I'd like to introduce Reverend Patricia Lisson then to make some summary remarks and recommendations for the UPR.
Thank you, Peter. As we hear this story and as we hold up this book, we realize there's a lot of work and energy and compassion and commitment to seek justice for the people of the Philippines. And Peter clearly outlines the process and the why of this compendium and why it was so necessary to pull it together. When we hear that our state and institutions refuse to take concrete, clear actions against the Philippine government dealing with human rights issues, we could not sit still and be quiet. And so this book was produced. In our household, we would say that we were all dreaming in Technicolor when we started this process, thinking that we would never get this far in such a short period of time. Starting in December 2019 and completing this whole process in 2022 is a major piece of work. In fact, I would draw an image to your imagination. Doing some community development teaching at our local university, we used the image of trying to construct a plane while in flight. That's how I felt when we started to work on this report. But as you can hear from our speakers, we were backed by clear, committed, and committed people and communities and organizations who had a clear message to share. And that message we just heard. And we hear from Name the question of witnesses from families who experienced the loss of children and family members. The courage that has taken her and the other families, members of Rise Up for Life, and all of the other people in the community that aren't a part of those organizations is amazing. They come forward to tell their stories at the risk of their life. We hear the story from sunny Africa on the economic situation, the battle of economics, the gap between the rich and the poor and how it's growing. And the smoke and mirrors, to go back to that image again that we heard in the other, Tina, I think, used it in the other presentation. The smoke and mirrors that, yes, the Philippine company is getting richer, but it, in fact, is getting poorer. So you have this mixed message. And so those figures that you're sharing are so critical and important. And Amira, the story of the Bangsamoro people is a humanitarian disaster that happened with very little recognition or holding the government accountable for such actions and the impunity of the government. So really, in our report and in the book, we bring it down to three major topics: the prevailing climate of impunity, and that climate of impunity allows killings, arrest, red tagging, the misuse of a legal system to crack down and to pull people, put people in jail when they raise their voices in dissent. So the weaponizing of a law, when we see the formation of the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, NTF, LCAT, and the Anti-Terrorist Act, those kinds of acts come up over and over again in this report and identify the stories of the witnesses that we had and heard from in this report. And the fact that currently in the Philippines there is no domestic remedies, legal remedies available for the peoples of the Philippines to bring their cases to a fair court of justice. And so we hear that over and over again. And so we've deemed these sort of topics under three categories. I call it the three illegal wars: the war on drugs, the war on dissenters, and the war on indigenous people. And when we hear that in that framework, when I hear that in that framework, I have a sense of urgency. We heard that in some of the earlier presentations. There is an urgency here. And somebody presented it this way: we have 2 minutes. We have 2 minutes to fix this. There's an urgency. And we think about this, we go back to the word justice. Justice comes from the Latin word just, which means the rights or laws. And all communities, organizations, and states, whether they're ancient or modern, have this discussion about justice. And in fact, when we have that discussion of justice, in fact, it is the glue. It's the glue that holds society together. A system of laws, a sense of balance, where people actually can expect, fight for, and have rights and fair and appropriate lifestyle and security of life and health and economics. And that's where we come to the UPR, because it is through our international communities that we're going to address, as we've heard, these issues of human rights violations. The UPR provides an international stage where communities, civil societies, states come together, work together, build solidarity together to address these issues of human rights violations. And that sense of urgency is heard over and over again. We have 2 minutes, 2 minutes to address these issues of human rights violations. And with that in mind, we just will reiterate our call to the UPR this on Monday, and just repeat some of the calls that you've heard already. The first call is to repeal the Memorandum Order 32 and the Executive Order 70 and investigate the former President Duterte for the unlawful implementation of these laws. These laws have enabled the weaponization of the legal system. These laws have created a war on dissenters. The second call is to continue the peace negotiations, I'll get it out, negotiations with the Democratic Front of the Philippines and the rebel groups in the Mindanao for self-determination. We believe that the peace negotiations are the road in which people can sit down, dialogue, and come together to lift up the sense of self-determination, which is missing and is not able to be accomplished through the system that's current in the Philippines. The third call is the reform of the criminal justice system to ensure prompt, effective, thorough, independent, impartial, and transparent investigation of all potentially unlawful deaths and bring all suspects, perpetrators to justice in fair trials in accordance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, on the Minnesota Protocol, address the pervasive climate of impunity, ensure speedy and proper investigation, arrest and prosecution, and conviction of the predators. These are the basic underlying principles that we will bring before the UPR on Monday, believing that we are in an urgent situation and that we have 2 minutes to address these issues and that we need action, not capacity building or technical assistance. We need action. I think somebody mentioned in the former presentation, we don't want another 10 years of seeking justice or seeking studies and whether there is a crime here. I think we've heard enough evidence, and certainly our report highlights that and puts it very firmly and carefully before us, so that our reports, our recommendations to the UPR really demands those kinds of action. And we thank you all for being here. Just before I finish, I would like to say thank you to our speakers, to Nana Pesco, Amir, Sunny Africa, and Peter, for being part of this presentation. I would like to thank our technical support that allows us to record and live stream. And those, the Investigate PH team who produced these reports, believe me, as I said, was quite a feat, and so there's a lot of behind the scenes action and people that aren't present here today. The team was huge, the commitment was high, and the seeking of justice was their purpose of being a part of this particular project, and it is represented in this book. And so thank you all for listening. As we say, the end is the beginning, and so we're just beginning on another journey. This is not the end, this is only one more step on the journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Okay, this really brings us to the end of this program. I'd just like to say a couple of things coming out of all that you've heard. That the decision of the International Criminal Court pre-trial chamber to launch the investigation, the meaning of that decision is that the Philippines judicial system has failed its people. And the international community would call on you to recognize this in the context of the Universal Periodic Review. It really is a time for action. The second comment is that in today's world there is a sort of a battle of grand narratives. Right now we have a grand narrative of democracies against autocracies. I'd just like to say that one of the impacts of this narrative is to marginalize stories like we've been trying to deal with and grapple with today. But in fact, if there's going to be any meaning to this so-called grand narrative, then the issues of the Filipino people and similar peoples all around the world struggling against abuse and violations of their basic rights, these people's needs and demands should be at the heart of what all of the international community is doing if we want to stand up for any rally for democratic rights and national sovereignty, when we want to stop wars between member states. So with those remarks, formally I declare we're launching this book, Impunity and State Terror, final compendium report of the Independent International Commission of Investigation into Human Rights Violations in the Philippines. I commend it to all member states, and we will be present on Monday for the session and really pay close attention to your deliberations, and we have high hopes that some positive action will emerge. Thank you very much, everybody.